At the risk of sounding like, and I'm going to give a brief introduction according to the agenda. I'm going to talk for about 10 to 15 minutes, if I may. And let me begin by saying that at the risk of sounding like a smartass, I wonder if it's time to disrupt disruption. I've been thinking about this notion since the middle of last year after reading an article in the New Yorker magazine by the Harvard historian Jill Lepore, which had the title, "The Disruption Machine, What the Gospel of Innovation Gets Wrong." Her piece is, I think, most noteworthy for its attack on her fellow Harvard colleague, Clayton Christensen, a professor at the Harvard Business School, one of the most highly cited business academics in the world, a guru among business gurus, and the person who more than any other popularised the term disruptive innovation. Christensen first came to fame in 1997 with the publication of his book, The Innovators Dilemma, a book that The Economist magazine subsequently judged to be among the 6 best business books of the last 50 years. The book was an attempt to explain the failure of respected and well-managed companies. Good managers face a dilemma, Christensen argued, because by doing the very things that they need to do to succeed, like listening to their customers, investing in the business, progressively improving the product that they offer to their established customers and building distinctive capabilities, they run the risk of ignoring rivals with so-called disruptive innovations. For those who like counterintuitive arguments, Christensen's is especially attractive. His explanation of why successful companies are vulnerable to disruption is wonderfully counterintuitive. Successful companies are vulnerable to disruption precisely because they are well managed, because they are successful. As a subscriber to the MIT Sloan Management Review, I recently read an article there by Andrew King and Balgir Batatoktok. I struggled with the pronunciation, so please forgive me, Balgir, if you happen to be hearing this at some stage. And the article that they wrote is called "How Useful is the Theory of Disruptive Innovation?" They make the point that few management or academic management theories have had as much influence in the business world as Clayton Christensen's theory of disruptive innovation. But how well, they ask, does the theory describe what actually happens in business? And the answer they provide is, in short, it doesn't perform very well at all. One thing their article does not address, by the way, is the key question of why has one of the most influential ideas to emerge from a business school in the past few decades received so little scrutiny from scholars? Why has it been accepted so readily? Good question. I should make it clear that King and Batatoktok are not arguing that there's little evidence of disruption. That would be rather silly. Instead, what they are saying, let's be clear, is that they have serious questions about the empirical validity of Christensen's theory about the nature of disruptive innovation. In fact, you could interpret their article as being, in part, a set of alternative explanations as to why the 77 instances of disruptive innovation discussed in Christensen's book, The Innovators Dilemma, occurred. Furthermore, they tackle the question of what in a world of disruption should managers do. And they disagree with Christensen there as well about what they think is the appropriate response. Now, I could outline the specifics of Christensen's theory for you, and you may be annoyed that I'm really not going to do that, but because I really don't want to take up my precious little time this morning describing the theory as such. What I want to do is talk for a little bit longer about the nature of disruption more generally, rather than the criticisms of Christensen's theory. Suffice it to say that, simply put, according to Christensen, a disruptive innovation is typically an inferior invention that eventually crowds out better products because it's cheaper, because it's more convenient, and for many customers, it's simply good enough. Eventually, it transforms the entire industry. Competitors with disruptive innovations, according to Christensen, lull incumbent companies into complacency by avoiding head-on competition and targeting, at least initially, new and low-end customers. Christensen also argues that disruption has a paralysing effect on incumbent companies. It challenges their very DNA because they're organised around how best to deliver and improve their existing products, and so they are, according to Christensen, constitutionally unable to respond to the threat of disruptors. Now, not only do I subscribe to the MIT Sloan Management Review, but as a good academic, I subscribe to the Chronicle of Higher Education. And I have to tell you that my eyes lit up last week, knowing that I was to address you this morning, when I saw an article by Evan Goldstein that had the title, The Undoing of Disruption. I like provocative titles, and I thought, this is a beauty. As it turns out, the piece by Goldstein is a story, yet again, about Clayton Christensen's theory of disruptive innovation and the criticisms that are now emerging of it. It's also a story that is to some extent critical of Christensen himself and of disruption, the notion of disruption more generally. On that note, I should point out that Christensen has published some 9 books, almost all of them co-authored, and has applied disruption to a variety of settings, including primary education in his book Disrupting Class, higher education in his book The Innovative University, healthcare in his book Innovators Prescription, and even how to lead a more meaningful life in his piece How Would You Measure Your Life? As I see it, part of the problem, part of the backlash that is now suddenly occurring against Christensen is that the theory of disruptive innovation has been applied to almost everything. Christensen now says that he regrets the name he gave to his theory and that he never thought, and I'll quote him here, that the word disruption had so many connotations in the English language that people would then flexibly take an idea, twist it, and use it to justify whatever they wanted to do in the first place. That's fair enough, but the fact is that Christensen himself has come up with some rather bizarre areas, I think, that he thinks are ripe for disruption, including conflict resolution, the environment, politics, terrorism, and the military. And he's also the co-author of an article that had the title Disrupting Hell. To quote from it, "It is time to introduce disruption into the domains of religion and ethics to restore Adam Smith's notion of moral sentiments. This requires a new toolkit of disruptive innovations by fearless early moral adopters." Goldstein, in his piece in the Chronicle of Higher Review, Review of Higher Education, the Chronicle of Higher Education rather, observes that the word disruptive has become an accolade and that an industry has grown up around it. Fortune magazine publishes a 40 under 40 list. In describing those on the list, Fortune says, they're all disrupting and they're all just getting started. Inc. magazine celebrates the rising stars who are disrupting industries, making millions and building successful companies. Forbes ranks young disruptors, innovators and entrepreneurs, while Vanity Fair has honoured the news disruptors shaping the future of media. Now, both Goldstein and Lepore note that last fall in the United States, the University of Southern California, USC, unveiled a new undergraduate degree in arts, technology and innovation. The university declared that this was a degree in disruption. You may begin to get the sense that both Lepore and Goldstein's criticisms stray beyond Christensen's theory and sometimes adopt a mocking tone towards the notion of disruption more generally. Goldstein notes that according to Christensen, disruption is nothing less than the mechanism at work behind the boom-bust churn of capitalism. But, Goldstein says, to true believers, and who in this audience is a true believer? To true believers, disruption is something more than the gospel of progress for the internet age. It's a democratic force that makes more things in it, education, air travel, healthcare, more accessible to more people. Interestingly, the Harvard Business School professor who rivals Christensen in star power, who might that be? Michael Porter, has been somewhat sceptical about the pervasiveness of disruption. Now, to argue this way here today to this audience attending something called Disrupt Sydney may seem heretical, but let me say that Porter argued in 2002, and so you may well argue that, well, what he said then may have been accurate, but look, 13 years later, forget it. He argued in 2002, if one reads much management literature, one would think that disruptive technologies are coming at us every day. And he added, I think that disruptive technologies that are successful in displacing established leaders are extremely rare. Now, you can disagree with Porter, of course, but he does at least pose a question that should be answered empirically. Lepore goes even further in being critical of the notion of disruption. Let me quote from her article, and Kai, I beg forgiveness right now. Here she goes. Ever since the Innovators Dilemma, everyone is either disrupting or being disrupted. There are disruption consultants, disruption conferences, disruption seminars. There's something called Disrupt Sydney. Disrupt or be disrupted, the venture capitalist Josh Lincoln warns in a new book, The Road to Reinvention, in which he argues that fickle consumer trends, friction-free markets and political unrest, along with dizzying speed, exponential complexity and mind-numbing technology's advances mean that the time has come to panic as you've never panicked before. Larry Downs and Paul Moons, who blog for Forbes, insist that we have entered a new and even scarier stage. Big bang disruption. This isn't disruptive innovation, they warn, it's devastating innovation. Now, Lepore makes some interesting points about the rhetoric of disruption, which she says is the language of panic, fear, asymmetry, and disorder. It calls on the rhetoric of another kind of conflict in which an upstart refuses to play by the established rules of engagement and blows things up. Startups, she says, are ruthless and leaderless and unrestrained. And they seem so tiny and powerless until you realise, but only after it's too late, that they're devastatingly dangerous. Such is the rhetoric of disruption. Lepore observes that every age has a period of rising and falling, of growth and decay, bloom and wilt, and that every age also has a theory about the past and the present, what was and what will be. She goes on to say that the 18th century embraced the idea of progress, the 19th century had evolution, the 20th century had growth and then innovation. Our era has disruption, which despite its futurism is in fact atavistic. Disruptive innovations, she says, holds out the hope of salvation against the very damnation it describes. Disrupt and you will be saved. Furthermore, disruptive innovation, she notes, is meant to serve both as a chronicle of the past, this has happened, and as a model for the future. It will continue to happen. One of the things that puzzles Lepore is that most big ideas have loud critics, but not apparently disruption. It's not clear that she is talking specifically about Christensen's theory or about the notion of disruption more generally. She does say, however, that disruptors ridicule doubters by charging them with fogeyism. And just to be clear, she notes, and I think quite rightly, that to criticise a theory of change is not identical to decrying change. You may think, if I may conclude now, that this is a rather strange and possibly heretical welcome to this, the latest in our series of Disrupt Sydney. And particularly after I received an email yesterday from Kai addressed to me as Dear Fellow Disruptor. But surely, as I said at the start, we may need to think about disrupting disruption. Let me quickly assure you that the economic historian in me is very sensitive, believe me, to the reality of Schumpeter's waves of creative destruction. And I have no doubt that in this digital era, disruption has become more pervasive and probably much easier to achieve. But the thing that intrigues me is the question of how far advanced are we really in offering convincing theories and empirically tested ones to explain disruption. I'd also like more precision about the incidence of disruption and how easily, in fact, we can dismiss Porter's claim that we exaggerate the extent to which disruptive technologies are displacing established leaders. And I worry, in particular, whether the term disruption is applied too loosely to too many things. But it's precisely because of those concerns that I'm delighted to have events like this so that we can learn more about the nature of disruption. So I very much appreciate your attendance here, and may it be a wonderful day. Thank you very much.